But to introduce everyone on the panel and guide us through this session, please welcome Managing Director of Vivid Inc. It's Paul Richardson. Now, Paul, can you hear me loud and clear, sir?
Coming through loud and clear. I hope you can hear me too.
Super. The floor is yours, sir. Looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you very much. Before we start the panel, let's do a little bit of scene setting. As the media increasingly reports on the transgressions committed by the apps on our mobile phones, what is this doing for the confidence of the consumers, and how does that affect brands and right owners for whom permission-based data collection is essential? So let's put that into context for a moment. The approximate number of app downloads first quarter of 2022 was 37 billion, and that's quite a number, an 11% increase from 2021. Now that may sound quite impressive, but we're starting to see one or two alarming headlines from such august journals as the New York Times that stated, "Your apps know where you were last night and they're not keeping it secret." And they go on to explain that at least 75 companies receive anonymous, precise location data from apps whose users enable location services to get news or weather or other information. The database reviewed by the Times, a sample of information gathered in 2017 and held by a single company, revealed that people's travels in startling detail, accurate to within a few yards, in some cases more than 14,000 times in a day. The Vox also ran a headline, "How Covert Code Enables Your Phone's Apps to Spy on You." Sensationalist stuff. The hidden trackers in your phone explain. It went on to say that trackers hidden in smartphone apps are the source of incredible amount of specific data about us, much of which gets sent to companies you've never heard of. This has been going on for years, and it's an essential part of the mobile app economy. But it took the COVID-19 pandemic to bring some of these companies and what they're doing to the fore. And that raises the genuine question, in whose interests is the data collected, and where does it go after that? But before we dive into that question, let me introduce the members of the panel today. Firstly, Caroline Mookian. Caroline has an impressive track record in the digital industry with a career that spans 25 years in roles with Real Media, Carrot Interactive, and laterally as an entrepreneur setting up her own business. Caroline sold the digital media agency she founded to the Wheel Oyster amalgamation as it became LBI, and one of the world's largest digital agencies prior to its sale to Publicis in 2012. Caroline led Publicis' Digital European arm for the business before taking a sabbatical and then returning to her roots as an entrepreneur and innovator. Caroline founded Mesh in February 2016, and today it's a global leader in Wi-Fi analytics for fan and visitor behavior. Greg Morris. Greg is a research director at Nielsen Sports UK, having joined the company early in 2022, working across a wide range of clients, including a number of projects around events and customer experience research. Prior to that, Greg was a senior brand research manager at Formula One, and he's also worked at a number of media owners, including Sky and Fox, during 17 years in the research industry. And last of the panel, Jake Pryzalak. I got that right that time, Jake. Jake is a 3-time award-winning market researcher, an insight manager at SailGP. Jake has worked with some of the most well-known organizations in the world, including Google, Airbnb, Formula One, and JP Morgan. Featured in Green Book, Quirks, and he is a Forbes columnist. I can recommend reading his column. I have done so over the last couple of weeks, and they're great. Day-to-day, Jake helps SailGP understand its audience whilst helping cross-departmental decision-making utilizing data insights. Now, on to the matter in hand. A question that I've heard Caroline ask when the subject of apps and tracking data is concerned is, do you know who you're taking home? This refers to the subject of articles in the New York Times, Forbes, Wired, Vox, Markup, all of which raise some quite serious questions as to the ethics and legalities of some data that's been collected surreptitiously without the knowledge of the consumer. In some instances, this has been used in a positive sense, but technology is also being used for less ethical purposes. So enough of listening to me talk. Let's ask our panelists for their views. So what does this raised and heightened consumer awareness mean for the live events industry, the sports industry, sponsorship in 2022 and beyond? when brand or rights owners want to collect tracking data. So first, let's go to Greg. Let's hear your views on that.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. There's something we could go into here, but I guess briefly, I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in my view. I think if you're looking at it from an events industry point of view, if you're running an event, you've definitely got to be you've got to be very diligent with the data. You've got to be prepared to explain what data you're collecting and what you're going to do with it. I think a lot of the public are aware that data collection is a lot more common than it used to be, and that a lot more of their data is being collected, but not with a great understanding of what is being done with it and what it actually means. And that can kind of project a little bit of fear, I guess, for some people. And so I think you have to be prepared to be open about what you're doing with the data to allay that. On the other hand, I think there is an element for the events industry that a lot of people I think are still quite willing to share data where there's a perceived sort of benefit for them, and generally in the events industry there is a perceived benefit for them because they're choosing to go to sports events, music events, whatever it is, that they want to attend and that they're getting enjoyment out of. So from that perspective, there will be maybe more willingness to share some of their data than there would be in other circumstances, I think.
Okay. There was an interesting demographic in some of the research before holding this panel session that they were saying that age plays a very high degree of a part in this, and an interest, and it seems to be the demographics seem to be skewed. The Axiom DMA research said that 4 in 5 teenagers aged 16 to 17 have said they won't allow something like an ATT prompt, and 71% of those over 54 will. So leaving the cohort that's most likely to share the data in that 25 to 35 category. And the graph in the research is quite an interesting U-shape in terms of the most concerns being at the lower end, people data savvy, and at the higher end. So in terms of thinking about that, Jake, how does that affect what you do within SailGP?
Great question. So I think at SailGP, when you see an event, we have around 250 sensors on our boats, which we analyze that data from a boat perspective, and we share all that information with fans, but also our athletes as well. So we try to be transparent right at the top of the sort of high performance element of the sport, but then also make sure that that's translated back to our fans. I think when it comes to sort of the commercial research that we undertake, which helps from a sponsorship, but also trying to grow the sport, I think that's where we need to, for me, that all starts from sort of the core of the business in terms of why are we sort of conducting that research, and is there a fundamental reason for conducting that research, whether it's at the event or whether it's back here at HQ in London. And then that's how the important bit then is actually how can we tell fans that we're maybe conducting this research or what's it for. So I know a lot of our sort of on-site research it's quite, you will see it there, and you will see people walking around asking for your opinions, but then how we sort of disperse that information internally. Obviously, a lot of different sports rights holders can do better in terms of sort of sharing that information across to its fans as well, which I think, everyone's trying to sort of improve on.
Okay, and Caroline, as one of the technical suppliers and providers to the industry that allows data to be captured, your views at the start. What does this heightened awareness mean? What does a better informed consumer mean to data capture?
I think it means that, and Greg, both Greg and Jake have touched on this, but that the value exchange needs to actually be valuable, and valuable for the consumer. So historically, I think when we have potentially as an industry and I don't just mean events, I guess I mean kind of maybe the broader marketing industry, the collection of data has usually been for the benefit of the collector, so the brand, or they want to build their database and increase their understanding and profiling of individuals to drive usually some form of commercial gain, right? So sell more tickets, increase the average order value, whatever the intent might be. I think data, they want and are still willing to exchange it, but they have to understand what the benefit to them is. And that benefit can be functional, and it doesn't necessarily need to be about a discount or an offer. But I think it's important that we are honest with ourselves, and we make sure that that value exchange is applied, is meaningful, and that we are collecting data with purpose, and we act on that purpose, and we deliver on the intent and the reason behind picking or collecting the information in the first place.
Okay. Interestingly, that plays through in some of the other research that's come out in terms of the shift in how people are exchanging that data and where the balance of benefit seems to be. That the tracking data has predominantly been in the hands and for the benefit of the brand and the rights holder, but now there's an increasing shift for that to move over to the consumer. So coming on to the next question about that, then in terms of the benefits and that shift, how is that demonstrated and communicated to the audience? What is it that the wider marketing community can do to communicate that there's a greater benefit in sharing the data, and also what will happen afterwards? How do you do that in real terms? Jake, let's start with you this time and go around the other way.
Yeah, because so I think from our perspective, we obviously have races all around the world, and I think one of the tricky things for us is that we'll do a lot of on-site research to find out what fans are thinking of a particular event, but then the fan may not actually see that event again until the next season, so they might have forgotten about that particular experience. So it's actually feeding in after post-event, it's feeding in other pieces of content to make sure they're still engaged with SailGP, but then also offering different snippets of information to show that actually we're making some changes off the back of your feedback. So when you do, or if you return to the event next season, you'll be able to see those sort of changes being made and the progress being made. So I know from a broadcast perspective, I'm doing a lot of work behind the scenes at the moment to make sure that we're engaging fans across our sort of broadcast and TV off the back of sort of feedback and the data we receive. So I think if we're continually providing feedback back to our fans, then we're obviously engaging them in a sort of a one-to-one process, and I think that's really important as we try and grow the sport. And I see that the same from a sponsorship point of view as well. So when we're sort of collecting data on site, it's making sure that the fans understand why we're collecting it, and how it's helping the sport to grow and offering them a really valuable experience on site or whilst they're watching online.
Okay. Greg, from Nielsen point of view, in terms of research, how do you start to communicate the benefits to the consumer? How do you get to give them the comfort that their data is safe, secure, it's going to be of their benefit, and they're going to be the recipients of what it is? How do you start that dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, so I think generally, without wanting to get overconfident, I think generally the market research industry is in sort of a fairly good place with this, because we do and have for a long time worked with kind of quite high standards in terms of how we protect the data of panel members and people that take part in our research. And I think particularly if you're talking about more traditional methods, whether that's focus groups or online surveys, that kind of thing. I think these things always go out with the message that we're not looking for individuals' responses. That the kind of data will be aggregated and anonymized, and I think because we work with quite high standards of how we protect the data, the people that are on the panels and take part know that they can do that without any issues. I think there are more questions maybe with some of the more kind of technology based research methodologies that are kind of becoming increasingly common nowadays. Methods that use sort of passive measurement rather than asking you questions, and like traditional survey methods. I mean, I've worked on projects in the past using things like facial recognition technology, which are a little bit harder, I think, to deal with. I think generally, if people know that it's kind of a reputable market research company that are running these projects, you will be able to manage it. But there are going to be more questions probably from what will happen with the film that is produced as part of that. I think that is a bit more of a question, and there's also probably a question for us to ask sometimes about what the most appropriate methodology to use in some of these projects is. I think sometimes brands like to use methods that seem innovative and particularly from a technological point of view, that but whether they are always the most appropriate methods to answer the question that that the brands have, that's sort of something that I think always needs to be borne in mind as well.
Okay, and I know that this is an interesting topic and a hot topic, as Caroline and I have discussed this very recently. Greg, you brought up the subject of facial recognition as a method of capturing data and as part of a tracking process. Caroline, you have some interesting views on this from a conversation we had before. Would you like to share some of those with us?
I think that, and I think also, Greg's kind of elegantly touched on my thought processes, but it's a responsibility to understand: is it ethically okay that whether I've had a bad day? Like, is it all right that there's a camera in a screen that I'm not looking at as I trail my kids through a shopping mall where they kick and scream because they've decided that they don't want to wear pink this afternoon? Where is it that looking at people's emotions or behaviors, it becomes intrusive versus actually meaningfully applicable, and where is that how is that a value exchange? And those are questions that I think that you need to ask yourself in terms of, is what you're doing fit for purpose? Is it actually a balanced response to your needs? Does that approach and methodology really add value and treat the consumer fairly, I suppose? And in some cases, I think that those questions aren't asked often enough.
Okay, and that kind of leads on to another part. Did brilliantly. This brings this element of brand trust to the fore that we're talking about in terms of how much data you're capturing and what you're taking. An interesting stat that came out of a piece of research that I was looking at before in advance of this panel, and they were saying 40% of UK consumers place trust in an organisation as one of their top 3 factors that will make them happy to share personal information with a company. Bearing in mind, and we have a couple of examples, we've got Tim Horton, we've got H&M being hit with a €35.3 million fine in 2020, Vodafone same year. In Italy, they were hit with 12.25, and there's a kind of raft of these. So bearing that in mind, that's coming forward, people are starting to see this now, that brand trust, how do the tech companies and the companies behind, and we've got people sitting both sides of the spectrum here and straddling that, how do you build together a message and a marketing platform that will allow you to build that trust in the consumer to enable them to have that faith and that percentage of people share their data with you? What are some of the nuts and bolts that can be done? Greg, so come to you first on this one. What do you think can be done by the brands, not necessarily within Nielsen, but other organisations that you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think one sort of thing to mention to start with as well is that you made a distinction there between sort of tech providers and brands, and I think that's, to a large degree, I think, just a distinction that we have within the industry, and probably one that the consumer doesn't have to the same extent. So, when going, I think you mentioned in your intro, Paul, that I used to work at Formula One, and when I worked at Formula One, I think it was always important to remember that even though a lot of our activities were kind of contracted out to a third party, and the app was designed by somebody else, and so on, if something happened to the app, it was Formula One as far as the consumer was concerned. It wasn't, they wouldn't go back to the tech provider. They would be looking at Formula One. So it's really important for any brand to remember that, like, every kind of technical aspect, every kind of touch point with that brand relates entirely to that brand, really, and they've got to make sure that their providers are living up to the highest standards from that point of view. I mean, just quickly to deal with the point of trust. I don't think there's a shortcut to earning trust. It's it is something that comes with time, and if you look after your customers over a period of time, that is when they start to trust you. I mean, it's probably not ideal if you're a startup to hear that the kind of more established brands get a bit of a head start on you in that respect. But on the other hand, going back to what I said at the start, if you've got something that the consumer wants and sees a benefit from, I do think that overcomes some of that barrier as well. If it's a product they want, they feel they'll benefit from, whether it's in entertainment terms or practical terms or whatever, that can overcome that barrier a bit.
It's interesting you brought that up about smaller businesses. One piece that came out from the Axiom DMA research earlier this year, younger consumers, a great quote, younger consumers show a particularly strong willingness to share personal data to drive the competitiveness of smaller businesses. So here's an opportunity for those smaller and newcomers to the market. The younger part of that demographic does seem to side with the smaller companies and seems to place a lot more faith and trust in those organisations. Bearing that in mind, Greg, let's pop over to you in terms of what do you think that brands of all sizes can do, and can the big brands help the small brands to generate confidence, and how does that play with tech partners? Because if you have your favorite tech partner as a large provider, are you willing to, shall we say, share them with the smaller startups and the new guys on the block?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think I'm not sure I've got a ready-made answer to it, to be honest, but I think it's a really interesting point about the willingness to of the younger generation to kind of to give a chance to some of the smaller companies. It probably goes against a little bit against what I was saying a moment ago, and more established brands having a head start on trust. But I suppose that is a counterpoint, isn't it? That you mentioned some big brands earlier that have had issues with data, with protection of data, and these things obviously make the news and can have an impact. I think there's also maybe a little bit of cynicism sometimes amongst the younger generation about that value exchange of data. and maybe that plays into that a little bit as well.
Okay. Greg, go on. You're keen to get in there, Greg. Go. Sorry, Jake. Sorry.
Sorry. No,
Sorry. Apologies.
no. I was more going to say, I think a couple of things from my side on this sort of topic is very similar to Greg. We work with a number of different sort of agencies and partners, and at the end of the day, it does come back to sort of Sale GP, and everyone is working for us to some extent. So any issues that happen on site, it all comes back to Sale GP. Any data that gets misplaced, it all comes back to sort of Sale GP. I think the brands I always find fascinating though in this space is those who do make a mistake and they're quite transparent about that mistake as well, and they're quite transparent with their customer base and their audience to say, well, actually we've mucked up here. This is what we've done to rectify it, and this is how we're maybe going to compensate you or help you with a further transaction or something else. So there's a bit of an ownership point of view from brands when something does happen. So I think the more transparent organisations can be when mistakes happen, which they do, it's just part of life. I think more the better. I think on your point around that sort of younger audience, I think what we found and what I found previously at YouGov is that there's pockets and pockets now of organisations who are coming out to actually monetize your personal data. So I think there's an actual target audience there now who do understand how your Google, Facebook, Amazon, and all those other sort of big tech providers are actually collecting our data, and they've worked out that actually we can make money for ourselves from our personal data without actually sharing it wildly with a lot of these other tech providers. So I think we'll find out that in 10 to 15 years time we've got actually a population that is very, very tech savvy and understands what your Googles, Facebooks and other tech providers can actually collect from ourselves, and how can we then get some sort of compensation back for it moving forward.
It's interesting you bring up the point there. You were talking about people, the mea culpa moment when something happens. Do you think, from your experience and what you see, that level of honesty and integrity actually increases and builds brand trust, in that you've actually said you've come clean? I mean, we've seen it in a number of cases in the marketing sphere where people have actually said that and the brand has been enhanced. So do you kind of feel that's the way things may be going, that honesty and integrity part?
I think so, personally. I think it shows that you're essentially building in public, I would say, and that every organisation, whether you're multi-million pounds in revenue versus a startup, you're still sort of building in public, and people are going to make mistakes. I know there's going to be a pocket of audience who will say that we don't want to share this bad news. It's going to throw us under the bus type of thing. So I definitely get that part of the argument. But from myself and like the research that I've conducted previously, it shows that actually if you do show the ugly side of your business, the things that sometimes go wrong and how you're trying to solve those issues, it obviously builds that sort of trust in your brand. But then also people try to consider you more as well, because they know that you're bringing that fan along with that journey, or that customer along with your journey as well. And I think that's really important. If you're trying to grow that sort of fan growth or that fandom, you need to bring them along that journey, whether it's the good times or even the times where you're trying to improve.
Caroline, as a tech provider, where does the balance of this lie between the brands and the tech providers in terms of showing that honesty, that integrity, and helping your brands build that trust with their consumers?
I get asked about once a week if our technology can do something that either is uncomfortable or illegal, depending on what country you're in or what the brief is. So, the first sort of sentiment that I have in terms of what the guys have just talked about is that I think that we need to ask ourselves, just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. And just because something is technically feasible you've got to question whether it's ethically right and it will deliver a genuine benefit to those involved. And if you can answer yes, then by all means sort of proceed. But if it's a case of I'm doing it because it will help me, then I think that you need to probably hold yourself to account and make a decision based on what your values are and what you stand for and who you are. So I'm a bit of a believer in just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should from a tech perspective, and that we focus on doing a few things well and not trying to be unnecessarily clever. And then I think as well that we need to differentiate between what's collected and what's inferred, or how that data is applied. Collecting, a piece of information, 36, right? That's not interesting. Yeah. What is interesting is if it's 36 journeys between point A and point B on your car's sat nav, and point A is your home and point B is your your school, and you look at the times of day and you can infer then that this is where this person's family are educated, or this is where they work, because you're inferring from the patterns in that data that is collected. That becomes slightly more grey for me. The data collection itself might be an exchange that a customer is prepared to make, but I think we also need to think about telling them how we use it and what we do with it. So at the moment, we're probably okay. And I say we, meaning all of us collectively, are okay in terms of telling people what we collect. I'm not entirely sure if we can say the same thing about what we infer from that and therefore what we do with it subsequently. I think that might be an area that we need to work on moving forward. That's what I was just thinking while Greg and Jake were chatting.
Because that awareness kind of and the understanding of the consumer in terms of what it is that they have is kind of borne out by the stats of recognition for those lovely 4 letters GDPR, which we've all kicked around for the last few years. And an interesting stat was that the awareness of GDPR is 73% in 2022 amongst consumers. Now, obviously, that will slice and dice as you move through that piece of research and that data. But an overall figure of 73%. I can remember 2 or 3 years ago where people, when you mentioned GDPR, would just look at you completely blankly and say, well, that's what I want to do. And you kind of keep having to go around that cyclic conversation. You can't, because it's not open, it's not transparent, it's not permission based. With that rise of GDPR, do you as a group feel that that's what's fueling the increased awareness and the understanding of data, and how people may be more willing to trust because they understand the process if something is supposedly GDPR compliant? And let's go back. Who wants to take that one first?
Could I just jump in here? Sorry.
You can, absolutely.
Because then I might put Caroline on the spot a little bit for this.
Knew that was coming.
So I think there's definitely sort of increased awareness for GDPR, and I think if you look in the States as well with the different laws, there's quite a lot of sort of awareness of those, even though they change quite a lot as well. I think what there isn't a clear understanding of what GDPR is. So if I ask my dad, which is a standard use case, he will say GDPR is all about emails and what information you have from someone's email address. He wouldn't know to what extent tech providers or other suppliers at an event, let's say, are maybe tracking you or collecting data from you, and if they're doing that in a compliant way. So I think, yes, GDPR has been sort of mentioned a lot in the press, and you see like what you've mentioned in terms of the fines we get. But I think the level of understanding is quite low, personally, I think. And there isn't a clear understanding of how GDPR is used across the marketplace when it comes to data and research. So I know, like, from Mesh and Caroline's work, that is all GDPR compliant, but whether everyone understands that clearly enough is probably Caroline to answer that one.
Oh, it's a panel discussion. It's not me saying that we're better than anybody else, you know? I mean, I think the fact that I think the fact that we're having these conversations is important, and I think that the fact that you know, we are openly discussing it is probably the most meaningful thing here. And I'm sure we can do more, the same as everyone can, which goes back to Paul, your question about who's responsible, and the answer to that's everyone. Like, it's not on me the same way it's not on Jake as a rights holder, it's not on Greg as, you know, the research consultant, and we all have a role to play in ensuring that we are behaving in a balanced fashion.
Okay. Greg, would you like to come in on the back of this?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure there's a huge amount to add. I completely agree with what Jake and Caroline have said, and I think particularly what Jake was saying about, I think that the awareness of GDPR is relatively superficial in general. I think people know that there is a thing called GDPR that has something to do with protection of data, but they probably don't really know exactly what protections it brings. So I mean, I think it might contribute to you know, an increase in trust a little bit, but you know, that can probably quite easily be counterbalanced by some of the negative stories that come out from time to time. I think also one of the sort of interesting things, just as a related to this, I think is the pandemic, and I think during the pandemic, I think we became quite used to seeing data about people's behaviours. You know, seeing data about the number of people that were undertaking car journeys and the number of people that were on foot or on trains, or you know, how much footfall was down in city centres and stuff like that. And I think it was interesting at times to see people's reactions to that, because again, I think people probably didn't always have a great understanding of how that data was being collected, and it could give the impression at times that kind of we were all just being monitored all the time.
But not what the vaccine was for, to track us all.
Well, yeah, exactly. So they must have had something before that as well. But no, I mean, joking aside, I mean, you know, yeah. I think you know, it was interesting to see people's reactions at times, because that was, I suppose, could have been viewed a little bit more in a little bit more of a malevolent way by some people, because it might have felt like people were looking at whether you were leaving your home rather than just seeing how much time you spend on an app, or whether you buy something on an app, or something like that. So I mean, that's probably set things back a little bit, if anything, over the last few years.
It's interesting.
I think it raised the awareness quite a lot, and I think in some, depending on everyone's entitled to their views, right? And there's lots of different perspectives on COVID, and people have it's brought out quite a strength of feeling. But one of those groups, and I'm in it, think that sharing the information about where I am, the value exchange there was so as I don't get sick, and so as I don't infect my elderly parents and potentially, you know, put them in significant risk. That to me is a value exchange that warrants supplying the information. That to me is a fair trade. I appreciate that there's other people that have different perspectives on it, so, and which is grand, yeah. But from as an individual, I can go right. I know that sharing my data on this occasion, this is what I get in exchange for it, in theory. So I'm good with that. Tick. And I think in some ways, it's one of the things that has driven the requirement for that value exchange to be meaningful. And the fact that you can't just collect information for the sake of it anymore. There has to be a valid reason. There has to be a meaningful and purposeful reason that the consumer provides you with these details in exchange for.
I think one of the other slight issues with sort of GDPR and data protection is it's not the sexiest thing for companies or brands to talk about. So the only time it is going to get mentioned is the negativity, when brands get fined or when an issue gets highlighted or something big has happened. That's when it will get its sort of limelight, which means that everyone has a negative connotation to GDPR, and you don't necessarily see maybe the hard work behind the scenes that companies do have to go through to use a piece of technology or go through GDPR in different countries, that it does take a lot of time to get right, which doesn't get highlighted. It will only get highlighted if shit hits the fan and something happens.
Is there and feel free for anybody to join in, is there a duty of care then at this point for the brands and the tech providers to think about how they can educate the public? I think we'll probably all agree sitting around here that if we leave it to the government, we'll probably be all old and retired by the time to get that message out and into people's heads. But does the industry have a responsibility collectively for the credible players, the honest brokers of all of this tech and data capture and tracking? Does it have a responsibility to communicate to its own individual audiences to build that knowledge? Who'd like to go first on that?
I'm happy.
Go on.
Okay.
Go on. Go.
It's a difficult question. I think yes, it does. I think we do have a responsibility to educate the pub as far as possible. But I think exactly how you educate is quite a difficult question, because as Jake said, it's not a very sexy topic. It's quite a complex topic when you get into the detail, and it's a bit like kind of giving people lots of terms and conditions on a contract. That a lot of the time people don't really read it properly. So I think you've got to try and find ways to do that in small sort of bite-size portions. Otherwise, I think people will just glaze over a little bit probably.
I think from our side, I think it's a interesting area. So I always think that, like, even as a consumer of a brand, if someone tells me that I'm going to get a survey, or they may be watching for my facial expressions at an event, would my behaviour change because I know I'm being tracked to that extent? So by being completely open and honest and having that free for all, this is what our GDPR is and this is what is happening, would my actual behaviour change in any way because I know that is happening face to face? And I think that's a really interesting area for debate, I guess, in terms of how much can you tell a consumer, but then to what extent could that actually sway or impact on their actual behaviour if they didn't know every step or their facial reaction was being sort of monitored.
That's kind of back into the classic, if you observe an experiment, does the fact of the observation change the results of the experiment that you're observing? So yeah, I mean that's quite a challenge. Can we have another 45 minutes on this, because that's quite an interesting area to explore. One of the last things that we'll touch on before we wind up is just in terms of what we just talked about, in terms of the awareness of people of where their data has been taken, what's been happening to it, the fact that the the mainstream media are becoming alive to this now, and they're publishing various stories. And as I say, we use the Tim Horn example. Those kind of things are the ones, I think, as Jake quite rightly said, they're the ones that seem to hit the headlines. Where, just as a quick thought, where do you see data capture, the use of apps and software to capture that kind of information, be it facial recognition, whatever it may be, anonymized data, detailed personal data? Where do you see that tracking over the next 3 to 4 years? Bit of a prediction, bit of a kind of crystal ball gazing. Caroline, as you're close to the palace, let's go to you first.
Well, I was about to say, if it doesn't grow and develop, then I'd better find a new job. So, I'm optimistic that we can navigate challenges. And I do think that understanding people movement is an interesting science, and it is something that can add real value. So I hope that we will navigate what's going to be a fairly complex couple of years, but come out the other side with a well-established and well-understood and professional sort of set of accepted behaviors, so that the act of looking at people's movement is considered more mainstream, and less of a kind of technological wizardry at the moment.
Okay. And Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will grow. I probably sounded a little bit pessimistic earlier when I said that the pandemic had kind of set people's attitudes towards it back a little bit. But I think, over time, people's understanding of what's going on will improve, and kind of remove some of the issues that people have with it. Obviously, that's provided that brands and tech providers are behaving properly, but I think the vast majority obviously do behave properly. I think the only other thing I would say is, as we touched on, I kind of hope that people become a little bit more sophisticated about how they use it. I do still think at the moment there's a bit of a tendency to, as Caroline touched on as well, to because they can and collect data because they can. And I think as the novelty of what people can collect wears off a little bit, that will hopefully ease off, and people will become a little bit more sophisticated about when they choose to use that type of data.
Great. And Jake, do you want a final thought on this?
Yeah, I think it would only piggyback on what sort of Caroline and Greg have said, really, in terms of I don't see that marketplace reducing in any size. It's only going to grow. But I think the way it will start to work is it will be sort of work smarter, rather than sort of willy-nilly. We're not just going to be collecting data for the sake of it. A little bit like Greg said, there's always got to be sort of a purpose to that sort of data collection. And I think the more transparent we are with those sort of techniques that we're using and what it's being used for, the more I think the benefit there will be with that sort of technology moving on in the next sort of 3 to 5 years. I don't think it's going to go away. I think there's probably a lot more hurdles and challenges to overcome, which is only good for that particular industry, because I think the more challenges there are, the more people will understand that market better and understand the benefits there is and what sort of hurdles it is sort of helping them from a consumer point of view in the future.
Great stuff. Okay, well, I think we've about reached time. If there are any questions that have come in from the floor, are there any that we'd like to present to the team?
Absolutely. First and foremost, thank you very much to our panel there. A very interesting session. There are a couple of things coming I'd just like to touch base on. Firstly, thank you very much to James Dixon. Just dropped a note in the chat. If anyone would like access to closed captions, it's going to enhance your experience. There is a link there to make your experience a little bit better. But a question that has come in for the panel from Sagar. Any recommendations how we can build attendee engagement ahead of our event? Assuming that's from a data perspective.
Definitely one for the boys, not one for me.
I'm presuming that.
Go,
Go on.
go on, Jake. You go ahead.
No, I thought you were about to talk then, Greg. I think from our side, we obviously have a large database per event of attendees who have previously attended an event, but also those who have maybe have an interest in the sport. So it's sort of dropping seeds or nuggets of information about the sport prior to the event that we do consistently. And I think that consistent messaging is really important. So don't wait until the last week before an event to share some information. Make sure that as an event, people are sort of aware of it over a sort of a consistent period of time. So then when it does come time to either sign up to a ticket or gain an interest in it, you've already got someone aware and maybe considering signing up to the event. So I think any sort of planning and data that you've got in-house, try to utilize that as much as you can, because I'm sure there's a story to tell as well.
Yeah, I think sorry if I can just very, very quickly sort of add one thing to what Jake said. I think one sort of experience I've had at the brands where I've worked in the past where we've put on events is that you can't make too many assumptions that people will know much about what your event is going to be like and what there's going to be to do at the event. So I think, Jake sort of mentioned not to wait too long before the event to contact people, but also to give people clear information about what activities, what things are going on at that event, what things do they need to sign up to beforehand. People will sort of feel more comfortable arriving at the event with a good idea of knowing what to expect, and it also saves them time at the start of an event when they don't have to work out what's going on, and they don't have to kind of spend the first 2 or 3 hours at a venue just working out what's going on. They can get stuck straight into things.
And I think that's probably, sorry, just to jump in, that's probably where, if your messaging is hyper personalized, that's where you reap the benefits of your marketing for an event. So let's just say you've got an audience of family members and you're bringing children to the event. They're not too interested in maybe what, I don't know, the high-end adrenaline lounge looks like, because they want to keep their kids really busy in the activity section at an event. So it's making sure that each sort of segment of your audience has sort of hyper-personalized content to make sure that, like Greg said, before they turn up to the event or when they do, they know exactly what's happening at the event, tailored to who they are and what type of things are of interest to them. And I think you build up that information base over time when you're creating an event, and that's something that we're learning season by season. We're collecting information on our fans and how that is changing per event, so then we can sort of share personalized content and personalized information suited to them and who they are.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, gents, for those answers. Also, Cigar, if you do want more information, just let you know what's happening tomorrow at 10 a.m. Building the buzz before your event, how to get your attendees going before they arrive. That is literally session number 1 tomorrow morning in London. So if you want to touch a bit more on that topic, that is the place to go. One more question before we do say goodbye to our panel today. What should planners be taking into account to protect data security? That's from Badar. Who'd like to field this one? So what should event planners be taking into account to protect their delegates' data security?
It's a big question. I mean, a lot.
Yeah. I mean, it feels a little bit like a technical question, partly a technical question as well, I think, in sort of my experience. But I mean, this kind of probably goes to making sure that you're sort of fully across GDPR and so on. But we in some of my previous roles, we would always be across what the sort of the requirements were going to be of any data that we had. So things like the period of time that we could retain data for after an event or a project or whatever we were collecting the data for, and making sure that we had the processes ready in place if certain things happened, like a request to see what data we were holding on people. I think it's just important that you get yourself aware of what processes, what requests can come in, what issues can arise, and what processes you need to be in place to deal with them if they do arise.
Fantastic. Well, I think that is about our time. Just want to say a massive shout out and thank you to all our panel. So, Gur, thank you so much for the great session and your inputs. This was really helpful. Absolutely spot on. So, once again, many thanks to our panel and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Take care, everybody. Okay, ladies and gents, still to come. We have got plenty going on today, as I say. If